Hello Internet, this week I decided to fully replay and complete Telltale's The Walking Dead Season 1. Now it's been 10 years since the release of this game and I was pretty excited to play it again and see if it actually holds up. In this video we're going to talk a little bit about the company behind the game, that would be Telltale, the franchise as a whole, which would be The Walking Dead, and my impressions of this game 10 years later. So first of all, let's talk about Telltale Games. Prior to the release of Telltale's The Walking Dead, I wasn't even aware that this company existed. And that seems to be a pretty common theme. This was the game that put them on the map for the average player, and after the release, everyone in gaming knew who Telltale was. The company actually started back in 2004, founded by three people who had previously worked at LucasArts making some of their adventure games. For those of you who are too young to remember, LucasArts made some excellent games once upon a time. These ranged from action-y, Star Wars type games to my personal favorite, which was Zombies Ate My Neighbors. They were pretty well known for their adventure games as well, most notably the Monkey Island franchise. Anyway, it was around this time in 2003-2004 that LucasArts had canceled a Sam & Max sequel, and they were just generally pulling back from the adventure genre of gaming. In the end though, they did ultimately leave LucasArts and they formed their own company, specifically planning to release more adventure games and specifically focusing on interactive dramas. The older point-and-click adventure games often focused a lot on puzzle solving, but this new company would instead focus on the narrative elements of storytelling. Telltale at that point began releasing games, although most of them are, in my opinion, not very noteworthy and they didn't really meet any significant success. It's not that these games were actually bad, I've looked at footage of them on YouTube, but they just didn't get much traction in gaming. For example, they released several licensed games in the CSI franchise. The UI in these games did not look great, the models did not look great, and the games possess many of the issues that are found in later Telltale games, which, of course, we'll get into later in this video. Although these games were generally regarded as fine or even well liked by a lot of people, they really didn't appeal to a broad audience. And licensed games are often like that. If you like the core IP, then you are more likely to buy the game. But if you're not a CSI fan, then you're probably not going out of your way to buy games set in that universe. Anyway, all of that aside, Telltale was churning out games and improving their style. But it wasn't until around 2010 that they connected with NBC Universal and they were tasked with making a few games for major properties. These were specifically a Jurassic Park game and a Back to the Future game. Both of these franchises were pretty universally beloved and both games were received pretty well. See what I did there? Universally beloved because they're from NBC Universal. Okay, doesn't matter anyway. Both of these games also play a lot like the games that we would see from them in the future, an evolution of the Telltale style. And then in 2011, working with Warner Brothers, the company was set to make two new games working from comic book franchises. There would be a game in the Walking Dead universe and there would be a game in the Fables universe. And if you're not a comic book person, both of these series are incredibly well liked and some of them had pretty broad appeal. The Fables books in particular are often very highly recommended for new people who are just starting to get into comic books and that sort of thing. Anyway, moving on now, we have to get to the part of the video where we need to talk about The Walking Dead as a franchise. And yeah, look, no, I know, I don't want to talk about it either, but we kind of have to. Now, I'll do my best to keep this really brief. I have lost a lot of love for this IP over the last few years, which is a pretty standard take for most fans. So anyway, back when I was a teenager in the 2000s, zombie media wasn't as popular as it is today. Nowadays, it seems like everyone is sick of zombies, that people say they appear in too many games and movies and yada yada, etc. But when I was young, there just wasn't much zombie stuff out there. We had the Romero movies, of course, and every now and then a game would come out, but it just wasn't enough to satisfy me personally. I've been a massive zombie fan since I was a little boy, and it never seemed like there was enough to satisfy that desire. In 2003, we saw the release of 28 Days Later, a film that in my mind marks the start of a zombie resurgence in pop culture. In 2004, Zack Snyder showed us that he could make a pretty decent zombie movie and then, ruin it with a nihilistic post-credits scene. Shaun of the Dead also released in 2004, and these three movies, in my mind, were the kickstart of modern zombie films. And without these films, I'm not sure if we would have had the amazing games or movies in the zombie genre that we have today. In terms of gaming, it wasn't for several more years that we'd start seeing things like Dead Rising and Left 4 Dead, which fulfilled the dreams of zombie fans. And then of course, Telltale's The Walking Dead came about a decade later. Oh, but right, anyway, I'm supposed to be talking about The Walking Dead. In 2003, the comics began releasing, created by Robert Kirkman and Tony Moore, who later was replaced by Charlie Adlard. I started reading them in mid-2004, and as someone who loved zombies and didn't have enough zombie media, I pretty well liked them. And several years later, AMC, an American entertainment company, decided to give The Walking Dead a chance at a television show. At the time, AMC was starting to break into original programming, but had only had some limited success up until that point. However, of course, after that, they went on to churn out quite a few hits. But anyway, The Walking Dead had kind of a rocky start on television, but then, it exploded and became one of the most popular television shows on the planet. So much so, in fact, that it actually outperformed the Super Bowl in terms of viewership. And the IP went on to release multiple television show spin-offs. They released board games, video games, novels, toys, blah blah, consumerism. And so here's the thing, internet, The Walking Dead, no matter how you slice it, was a massive commercial success. It was a genuine cultural phenomenon. And listen, I like Robert Kirkman. I remember seeing an interview with him somewhere where he talked about what it was like before he found success. He talked about how he used to lay on the floor as he cried and had anxiety attacks because he couldn't pay his bills and he was worried about supporting his family.
There was a point where I was like $40,000 in debt and I was making about $300 a year, and I would just lay in my living room floor and shake.
And frankly, that's my life. I live this experience at least a few times a month, and when I heard that, I felt such an intense kinship for this man that I immediately liked him as a person. I'm glad that he ultimately found some form of success, I really am. But every iteration of The Walking Dead declined in quality over time. The comic book started out really strong, trying to tell human stories, but then it devolved into basically just having supervillain human enemies. Every time they needed conflict, they invented some new wild supervillain. The television show started by telling human stories and having human interactions, and then devolved into supervillain after supervillain. The game started by telling human stories, and then they devolved into, yeah, you get it, right? It's supervillains. The whole show is just supervillains. All the games, all the books are about over-the-top human enemies that approach like supervillain levels of comical. It's my opinion that despite being a massive commercial success, The Walking Dead as a franchise does not actually produce quality products. And in fact, the majority of those products declined in quality over time. Anyway, I've been talking about the franchise probably too much. I have a lot of distaste towards where it ended up. We should probably just move on with the actual video, which was a reminder about Telltale's The Walking Dead. So anyway, after landing some decent IPs to work with through NBC Universal and showing that they could handle storytelling, Telltale was approached to do a game in the Walking Dead universe. At this point, Telltale's style had evolved, removing almost all puzzle elements from their game in favor of a more cinematic storytelling style. This is on full display in The Walking Dead. I'd never really noticed it before this playthrough, but there are clear intentions to use cinematic camera angles, for example. For comparison, in Mass Effect, which is another narrative-driven game, there's really only 3 camera angles that they use over and over for conversations. However, in The Walking Dead, we actually have moments where the camera will pull back. There's a lot of angle changes. There are some really cinematic set pieces. You can really tell that they wanted this to feel like a movie. There are a lot of cinematic moments. The other major driving factor of the game is that every episode in the game begins with the same message. This game series adapts to the choices you make. The story is tailored by how you play. And while this ultimately does not prove to be true, which we're definitely going to talk about later, it did captivate fans. By making an intentional choice to use cinematic camera angles, the game was presented like a movie where you, the player, could affect the narrative. And people responded incredibly well to those cinematic choices. The game sold more than 1 million copies in the first 20 days. It's usually pretty hard to pin down exact sales numbers, but we do know that they sold at least 8.5 million copies, which, considering that this was a game company that was relatively unknown at the time and that the television show had not yet reached its peak viewership, these are exceptional sales numbers. At release, the game was praised for its narrative, the diversity of its cast, and for the overall look of characters and zombies. Critics liked the game, fans liked the game, and it went on to more or less reinvigorate the genre of interactive fiction. Without Telltale's The Walking Dead, we probably would not have Life is Strange or Until Dawn, or games like that could look entirely different. The game follows Lee Everett, and our immediate introduction is him in shackles in a police car. The game does an excellent job at getting you straight into the game, immediately grabbing your interest. The first episode of this game is excellent for that exact reason. Lee is also not your traditional protagonist. Usually we see ultra-masculine white guy protagonists, and starting the game as a prisoner isn't exactly common either. And yes, I know the Elder Scrolls also start you as a prisoner, thank you for pointing that out. Almost immediately, and I really don't think this is much of a spoiler considering she's on the box art, but the game puts you in the position of caregiver for an 8-year-old girl called Clementine. And that's pretty much the game in a nutshell. You're going to meet some folks, you're going to fight some zombies, and you're going to do your best to protect a little girl. Games often add children for a specific reason. It's an effort to manipulate you emotionally. Trauma is more horrifying when it's a child's trauma, and players innately want to shelter children from the horrors of reality. And that obviously extends to, the zombie apocalypse. This dynamic, Lee's caregiver relationship with Clementine, is ultimately what hooked people into the game in the first place. It's also what people remember the most, the handful of sweet moments in the game between these two. Now, I will say that there are not as many of those sweet moments as people seem to think that there are. There's really only 5 or 6 really cute interactions between those two characters. I was surprised when I played it again because I remembered a lot more interaction between those two. But anyway, we've established that pretty much everyone enjoyed the game. I've pointed out some pretty good stuff here, so surely that means that it has earned a place in history, that it is entirely beloved. Well, no, the game definitely has a lot of shortcomings. People who remember it positively usually cite Lee and Clementine's cute moments as we just discussed, or they'll mention the emotional ending. There are a lot of people who say this was the greatest game of all time, but I think those people kind of forget the problems that it has. The game suffers from the same problems that a lot of interactive fiction does. There are pacing issues. Although the game starts and ends very strong, long sections of the middle really drag on in a very boring way. The characters themselves are painfully one-dimensional. This game stays true to the Walking Dead style. They can't just make a game about people surviving a zombie apocalypse. They have to add wild, over-the-top antagonists that behave completely unrealistically. A lot of the dialogue in the game is unnatural. A lot of the twists come out of nowhere, and the meta plot of the game languishes. It's just mundane. Now, as I said, the first and final episode have very strong moments that really engage the character, but the middle seems like it was almost forgotten. The game starts very strong, but episodes 2 through 4 feel like they are just padding to kill time until you get to the final moments of the game. Despite being well received and pretty well regarded even today, this game crumbles under a critical eye looking to review the game. However, now all of those things are varying levels of forgivable. There's really only one major problem with Telltale games that eventually caused fans to turn their back on the company, and that was how little your choices actually matter to the story. Most games, almost all games really, follow a very linear story, and honestly that's totally fine. We expect linear storytelling from games, but Telltale's The Walking Dead repeatedly tells you how much your choices matter. As I said earlier, every episode starts with the same message, telling you that the game adapts to how you play. There are also indicators in the upper left telling you that characters will remember the things that you say and the choices that you make. Unfortunately, this is mostly just an attempt to make your choices feel like they have more weight than they actually do. In reality, those indicators saying that a character will remember are often just flat out lies, as they have no impact on the plot or the dialogue, or that character might literally die in that same scene and so it was pointless. There are many choices in the game that change a couple of lines of dialogue or one line of dialogue and nothing else. And even this is poorly executed. For example, very early on in episode 1, a character asks Lee if he is Clementine's father. You get to choose how you respond to him. Some answers are flat out lies and some of them are closer to the truth. Now this does change a few lines of dialogue in the next couple of scenes. However, no matter what you choose, the character will still refer to her later as your daughter. Your choice in what you say literally does not even change the dialogue in that situation. And regardless of what options you choose in these interactions, that character is still very suspicious of you and basically tells you later on that you're a bad liar. And this happens no matter what you say, even if you've told him the truth. So obviously, in this situation, your choice is completely irrelevant because the game is always going to play out the exact same way. There are so many choices in this game that have really no impact on anything. Most of the character deaths are scripted and unavoidable. It doesn't matter what you choose as the player. Most of the choices that you make in this game have literally zero bearing on the plot or how the game progresses. Now, I'm not going to give spoilers here, it is a story-based game, but if you play it, you will see how little your choices actually matter. Anyway, this is the single thing that comes up the most when you talk about Telltale games. I asked a lot of people what they thought about this game. I read reviews, I read Steam discussions, and etc. And a major recurring complaint from players is that their choices did not matter even if they enjoyed the game overall. And for a game that touts player choice as a huge factor in how the story develops, this feels a lot like a betrayal. I think if Telltale had not tried to lie to you and say that your choices matter, then this game would be remembered much more positively. Now, despite this, players did not immediately abandon Telltale. As I said, the game was pretty well received at launch and it sold very well, especially when you compare it to older Telltale games. Name recognition for the Walking Dead franchise continued to grow, and the company produced a couple of sequels. Unfortunately, most of them lack the heart and emotional moments that we find in the first season. That's the one we've been discussing. And they all suffer from the same complaints that I've already made throughout this video. At the end of the day, Telltale's The Walking Dead is a story-based game. There are almost no gameplay mechanics at all. If you pick the game up, it's to experience the story. The problem is that it's actually a pretty bland story. Yes, people remember the emotional weight of the ending of this game, and yes, there are sweet moments between Lee and Clementine, which that seems to be the thing people focus on. But as I've said, the characters are one-dimensional, the dialogue is often unnatural, and your choices don't actually matter, and of course there are pacing issues throughout the game. But I digress, I guess. I've already expressed those thoughts. I really struggled with how to wrap up this video. It is something of a review / retrospective, and usually there's one question that these sort of videos end with. Should you play the game now? That is the question, and honestly there's not an easy answer. After playing many other story-based games in this same style, I can safely say that most of those are terrible. As of this recording, The Quarry actually came out pretty recently, and in my opinion it's a huge pile of trash. Despite that, it has been reviewed pretty favorably and it's generally well liked. And this is true for all of the Dark Pictures anthology games as well. In my opinion, they're all just very bad, but people seem to like them. And I think that this shows that people want these sort of games and they're willing to accept them even if they're not very good. Well, it's also possible, I guess, that I'm just overly critical, but if we start talking about that, the whole video sort of unravels, so let's just ignore that for now. When you compare Telltale's The Walking Dead to those games I just mentioned, then this is genuinely masterful. It is also one of the earliest modern games in this style to be pulled into the mainstream. Despite its many flaws, there are still plenty of people who regard this as one of the greatest games of all time. And while I don't personally think it rises anywhere near that level, it is mostly worth playing. But if you are a returning player that experienced this story years ago, I would guess that you're going to be disappointed. I came into this playthrough fully expecting to have an amazing experience. I was genuinely very excited. And this is because I remembered loving it so much when I first got the game way back in like 2015. And frankly, the game just simply could not live up to that level of nostalgia, and that's my own fault. I probably built it up too much in my head, but alas, this ended in me being pretty disappointed. Anyway, at this point, I've made my thoughts known. If you've never played the game, then yes, it is mostly worth your time. But if you've got a lot of nostalgia and you come in looking at the game with a critical eye, then yeah, the memory might actually be better than playing the game. Now regardless, hopefully you enjoyed a little background on the company, on the franchise, and the game, even if you don't necessarily agree with my opinions. Go ahead and hit me up in the comments and tell me I'm wrong. You know that you want to. I'll be back with more content in the near future, and I'll see you next time.
What's this thing?
Daddy said it's called a salt lick.
Yeah, but don't lick it. It's gross.
Did you lick it?
I don't know.